The spirit of the desert. In the heart of the Sonoran Desert, under the watchful gaze of a full moon, there exists a legend whispered among the locals, a tale of a naked woman who appears amidst the dunes, her eyes burning with a sorrowful rage. Her name was Isabella, a woman of unparalleled beauty, who met a tragic end that twisted her soul into a vengeful spirit. Long ago, Isabella was a beloved figure in the small desert town of La Esperanza. She was engaged to a man named Raphael, a charmer who promised her a life of joy and devotion. However, Raphael was deceitful, leading a double life with another woman in a nearby town. When Isabella discovered his betrayal, her world shattered. Consumed by despair, she confronted Raphael in the vast emptiness of the desert. The confrontation turned violent, and in his panic, Raphael struck Isabella down, leaving her to die alone in the unforgiving sands. Her final breaths were filled with a curse, a vow to make Raphael and all men who wandered the desert pay for her suffering. Years passed, and Raphael's fate was sealed when he ventured into the desert, never to be seen again. His disappearance marked the beginning of a series of mysterious deaths. Young men who traveled through the desert began to vanish, their bodies found days later, lifeless and with expressions of sheer terror. Locals began to report sightings of a beautiful naked woman appearing under the moonlight, her ethereal form wandering the dunes. Those who saw her would feel an overwhelming urge to follow, drawn by her haunting beauty and the promise of forbidden secrets. These men would meet there, and shortly after, their hearts seemingly stopped by an invisible hand. One such man was Lucas, a daring adventurer who scoffed at the old legends. He embarked on a solo expedition, determined to map the desert's hidden wonders. On the third night, under the full moon's glow, Lucas saw her. Isabella stood atop a distant dune, her figure illuminated in an otherworldly light. Mesmerized, Lucas approached her, his heart racing not with fear but with a strange longing. As he drew near, Isabella turned to him, her eyes filled with an endless sorrow that pierced his soul. "Why have you come?" she whispered, her voice a chilling echo in the stillness of the night. Lucas could not answer, his voice lost in the desert wind. He reached out to her, compelled by an unseen force. The moment his fingers touched her cold skin, a wave of anguish surged through him. Memories of betrayal, pain, and a love turned sour flooded his mind, and he understood her torment. The next morning, Lucas was found lifeless by a group of travelers, his face frozen in a grimace of profound despair. His death added to the growing list of victims, and the legend of the vengeful spirit spread further. Isabella's spirit remained bound to the desert, her wrath unsated. Yet, whispers among the townsfolk hinted at a way to break the curse, a long-forgotten ritual that required the betrayal to be avenged and her soul to be set free. But who would dare to venture into the desert, face the spirit's wrath, and uncover the secrets of Isabella's tragic past? The question lingered, the mystery deepening with each passing moon, leaving the intrigue of the desert's haunted nights to continue. The spirit of the desert continued. It has been several years since Lucas' body was found in the desert. Since then, no one else dared to approach this place. However, rumors about Isabella's ghost continued to spread, and there were brave souls who wanted to solve the mystery and free her soul. One of these daredevils was a young anthropologist named Marco. He was captivated by the legends of the desert and decided that exploring the story of Isabella could be the breakthrough in his career that he had dreamed of. Marco gathered all the necessary equipment and set off, determined at all costs to find a way to free the spirit. On the second day of his journey, Marco came across an old village, long abandoned and half covered with sand. In one of the houses he found an old diary belonging to a woman named Clara, a friend of Isabella. In the notes, Marco found details about the night Isabella died, as well as mention of a ritual that could free her spirit. According to Clara, for the ritual it was necessary to find a special artifact, a medallion that Isabella wore in the last days of her life. The medallion was a symbol of her love for Raphael and was supposed to be the key to freeing her soul. Clara wrote that the locket was buried with Isabella's body somewhere in the desert. Marco continued his journey, relying on Clara's diary. On the fourth day, he came across an old, dilapidated church. Under the altar, he discovered a secret passage leading to an underground crypt. In this crypt he found a sarcophagus with the inscription, Isabella, betrayed by love and doomed to eternal suffering. Marco opened the sarcophagus and found a medallion inside. As soon as he touched it, the figure of Isabella appeared in front of him, her eyes full of pain and hatred. "Why did you come here?" Her voice echoed through the crypt. "I want to help you, to free your soul," Marco replied, showing the medallion. Isabella stared at him intently, her expression changing from anger to surprise and hope. "If that's true, then you have to perform the ritual," she said, and her image began to fade. Marco read the ritual from Clara's diary. He needed to bring the medallion to the place where Isabella died and perform the ceremony under the light of the full moon. Meanwhile, in the shadow of the desert, an unknown force was watching his every move. Marco felt that someone or something was watching him, but he kept walking, relying on his determination and purpose. When the night of the full moon came, Marco was standing on the very spot where Isabella died. He began the ritual by reciting ancient words in Latin, holding the medallion high above his head. At that moment, the ground began to shake, and a strong wind rose around him. Isabella's figure appeared again, but this time she looked different. Her eyes were full of hope and gratitude. But before the ritual was completed, a man appeared from the shadows. It was Raphael, or what was left of him. His spirit was trapped in eternal torment, as was Isabella. "You won't free her while I'm alive," his voice was full of malice. Marco realized that Isabella's true liberation was possible only after the destruction of Raphael's spirit. He suddenly realized that Clara's diary had not mentioned the final part of the ritual, the sacrifice that had to be made. And then Marco saw a new spell hidden earlier on the pages of the diary. It spoke of the need for a voluntary sacrifice. But was Marco ready for this? The question remained open, as did his fate in the desert. The intrigue continued, leaving a mystery as to whether Marco would be able to complete what he had begun and free Isabella's soul, or whether he himself would become another victim of the cursed desert. The spirit of the desert, the way of sacrifice. Marco stood in front of the medallion, holding onto an ancient amulet. The figure of Raphael, his blurred face, as if woven from sand and shadow, was getting closer with every step. Marco knew that a collision was inevitable. The spell in Clara's diary flickered in the light, as if to remind her of its meaning. "You won't free her while I'm alive," Raphael repeated angrily, his voice echoing through the desert. Marco tried to concentrate. He knew that the ritual required a sacrifice, but what did that mean? There was no clear indication in the diary. Was this his life, or should it be something else? Isabella, her appearance becoming more and more ghostly, reappeared in front of him. Her eyes, full of pain and pleading, said that there was less and less time left. "Marco, you have to make a choice," she said, her voice trembling. "Only true self-sacrifice can put an end to this torment." Marco looked at the medallion in his hand and realized that the sacrifice had to be more than just his life. It should have been his soul, betrayed for the sake of another. He remembered how Clara had written about love and trust, how they had been destroyed by Raphael's betrayal. Perhaps the key was in this, in a sincere act of trust and self-sacrifice. Meanwhile, Raphael continued to approach, his shadow getting longer and longer, blocking out the light of the moon. Marco knew that there was almost no time left. He slowly knelt down and placed the locket on the ground. "I'm ready," Marco said, his voice firm, although he felt fear inside. "I give my soul for the sake of Isabella's release." With that, he closed his eyes and began to pronounce the final words of the spell. The wind rose around him, and the sand swirled in a frenzied whirlwind. The moment the words of the spell were uttered, the light of the moon suddenly intensified, illuminating everything around. Raphael let out a terrible scream. His form began to disintegrate, disappearing into streams of light. Isabella, on the other hand, became clearer and brighter. She went up to Marco and touched his cheek. Her touch was gentle and warm. "Thank you," she whispered. "You set me free." At the same moment that Raphael completely disappeared, the light went out, and everything around was plunged back into the silence of the desert. Marco opened his eyes and saw that he was standing alone among the sands. The medallion was lying on the ground, and the traces of all the events had disappeared, as if they had never existed. But something has changed. Marco felt warm and calm inside himself. Perhaps his sacrifice was accepted and his soul remained intact. Or he became the keeper of the peace of this desert, its new protector. Isabella's story is over, but there are still mysteries in the desert that need to be solved. The legend of the spirit and the medallion has begun a new chapter, and anyone who dares to come here will have to answer the questions left by time. The intrigue continued to live while the moon illuminated the silent dunes of the desert. Spirit of the desert, the finale after Raphael's spirit disappeared. Marco was left alone in the silent desert. He felt calm and peaceful, but this feeling was soon replaced by a strange feeling of anxiety. The silence of the desert became oppressive, and the night air seemed to freeze. Marco picked up the locket and felt its unusual warmth. Suddenly, he thought he heard a whisper. The voices, barely distinguishable, seemed to come from the depths of the desert. He looked around, but saw no one. These voices grew louder, as if surrounding him from all sides. "Set us free. We're here. Save us." Marco tried to figure out where these voices were coming from, but they seemed to penetrate his mind, driving him crazy. Suddenly, he noticed that the moon was beginning to darken, plunging everything around into darkness. He lit a lantern, but its light seemed too weak to disperse the surrounding darkness. He realized that he had to leave this place as soon as possible. But when he took a step forward, something grabbed his ankle. He looked down and saw an arm stretching out of the sand. The arm was skeletal, covered with decomposed flesh. Marco pulled away, but immediately felt another hand grab his other leg. He fell, and more of these hands began to appear around him, coming out of the sand. He tried to fight, but his arms were too strong. Suddenly, Isabella appeared in front of him. Her image became sad and sinister again. "Did you think you had freed me?" Her voice was cold and merciless. "My soul is doomed to eternal suffering, and now you're going to suffer too." Marco screamed, trying to pull away, but his hands were pulling him deeper into the sand. He felt his body begin to sink, sinking into a dark abyss. The last thing he saw were Isabella's eyes, full of hatred and despair. "You have become a part of this cursed land," she whispered, and his mind was plunged into darkness. The desert became quiet and calm again. The moon came out from behind the clouds, illuminating the silent dunes. The legend of Isabella's spirit continued to live, and anyone who dared to set foot on these lands risked becoming the next victim. The sands hid many secrets, and may forever remain mute witnesses to the horrors hidden in their depths. The story of Marco and Isabella was over, but the desert was still waiting for new wanderers, who were ready to reveal its dark secrets and pay for it with their lives.